Alright, today I want to revisit The Division 2 and talk about the current state of the game's player base. What I mean by this is relative interest, player base size, and community sentiment. When it comes to specific balancing, I don't feel like it's an area I can speak about with true authority because I've been fairly disconnected from the game for some time now, in the sense that I have not been composing new builds or grinding out exotics or learning meta techniques for PvP encounters and farming. I should disclose that a few years ago, this channel was actually formed around the original Division game. Back then, I exclusively played one or two games and covered mainly Division-related news, but in the time since I have diversified out to general industry coverage, which has been vastly beneficial to the channel, but also cut down on the amount of time I can really sink into any one specific game, unless I truly get hooked. I want to be very clear here that I do not have ill will towards the Division 2 or its development team. I quickly realized post-launch that the game was not entirely for me. A lot of what made the original game special had been altered, largely for the better, but with the side effect of reducing the number of things that I found to be truly appealing. However, I do believe that the game's launch condition was by far and away better than the original. It was superior to almost every other looter shooter on the market when directly comparing the scope of content that the day one game contained to them, and it truly deserved to be praised for that. I myself logged more than enough hours to justify the purchase. I don't regret it, I am happy to have played, and to reiterate, this is not an antagonistic piece about the game's current condition, it is an analysis on the declining interest levels which lead me to believe the game has completely stagnated. Previously, for the original game, we had access to Steam charts. Now, Steam charts is not a perfect determination of player base size, seeing as it only reflects the PC population, but it gave a loose indication of general trends. The game launched as Ubisoft's most popular fresh IP ever in history, but very quickly declined by over 90%. A few months after launch, after a few iterative patches, the game was in what is largely considered to be its worst condition ever, patch 1.3. Now, to summarize here, patch 1.3 was broken in a myriad of different ways. Exponential scaling on armor and damage mitigation made balancing almost impossible, auto-aim on consoles and one-shot mechanics were making the PvP experience a complete disaster, and if you were not running a very specific set of items and abilities, your entire team could be killed by one single shot from a shotgun NPC, and if you were running the right mechanics, it wasn't even fun. Not to mention the amount of technical issues and bugs which plagued the entire experience. Suffice it to say, the game was in a terrible condition, and the player base numbers reflected that. Now, the game did eventually turn things around and improve drastically, so I'm not arguing that a resurgence is impossible. Quite the opposite, in fact. I believe it is likely in the case of Division 2, but as it stands, the Division 2 appears to be in a very rough position with a long and bumpy road ahead. Somewhat recently, I analyzed the apparent decline in Apex Legends. This is somewhat different circumstances here because Apex Legends had used a new form of blitz marketing that burned out very quickly, and as a result, it began by rapidly assembling a player account metric of over 50 million unique accounts, while then completely stalling out and falling down to a tiny fraction of its once active players, viewers, and relative interest. Though the circumstances are different, the same tools can be used to analyze Division 2, and keep in mind these are anything but exact, however they give an indication of just how drastic the decline is. First up is Google Trends and search interest. Division 2, as a term, unsurprisingly peaked at and around launch day for the game. That was its all-time high. But since then, we can see a roughly 90% decline in relative search interest for the term. It's important to recognize that games often have a very large drop-off post-launch. This might not be considered outside the norm in this case either, but the value from these trends is offered up by comparisons. If we now search for another game, Anthem, which launched around the same time and had similar themes and mechanics, somewhat, that's a rather loose statement there, we can see it had a slightly earlier interest spike due to its demo phases, but the search interest persisted at a high level for longer, and when it did decline, it was only reduced to about 1/4 of its previous highs, where it remains somewhat steady. Unlike Anthem, the Division 2 has proportionally declined much further. Its decline was slightly less abrupt, but it was only now starting to level off at a consistent level of interest far lower than that of Anthem. At this point, I should say that I believe Division 2 is a monumentally superior looter. A large chunk of Anthem's interest was fueled by main stage failure, but now that the spotlight has passed, knowing how drastic Anthem's decline really was, but seeing it still persist at almost triple the search term interest of Division 2, it is something to carefully consider. Now we move on to Twitch viewership. Yet again, this is not an actual indicator on literal player base size, it is more a method of determining general interest. If we examine the peak and compare it to current viewership, there is a decline of well over 99%. However, if we examine a daily average, even then with a peak that is represented far lower, the average Twitch viewership for Division 2 has decreased by over 98%, very close to 99%, and still declining. Furthermore, Ubisoft has revealed that the initial sales did not meet their expectations, and while they did claim a tenfold increase in Uplay Store purchases on the PC platform over Division 1, this is not indicative of more purchases overall. It is a factor of the Epic exclusivity deal, which caused a large chunk of players to skip the Epic Store and rotate straight to Uplay as they were forced to buy the game somewhere other than Steam. Putting these factors together, while it is far from an actual concrete number for literal player-based stats, it shows that the game did not meet initial sales expectations, and then the relative search interest and viewership for it has declined by upwards of 90%, actually far higher than that, even faster than it did for the original game, which saw its lowest point in September, a full 6 months after release. Here's where I have to say I told you so. Back when the game first launched, I posted a video about how the Division 2 would have severe growing pains. I mostly focused on PvP since that is the area where specific balancing tweaks will matter the most, but this also carried over to PvE because changes in PvP, even while mostly disconnected this time around, would still have ripple effects which require the entire player base to adjust if they end up being major redesigns of existing talents or gear. That was not a popular video at the time. People were very upset about it and they made that quite clear and screamed into the void how wrong I was. But lo and behold, here we are. This is where I have to speculate on why the relative interest and by extension, I suspect, the player base is declining. Division 2 is primarily a PvE game. What I mean by that is the developers have clearly placed an emphasis on the mission structure, open world activities, and player versus NPC interactions. This is not a criticism, it is an observation. I have always believed personally that PvP is the true endgame activity. As you farm gear, what is that gear for? Sure, you can farm gear for more gear, I guess, to farm more gear faster, to farm more gear from different activities even faster, but eventually, after all of that, what is the final step? I've had this debate dozens of times, and no one that believes PvP is irrelevant has ever been able to tell me the answer. They screech and they whine that it's just to farm more gear, but eventually they are stuck at a dead end because when you have all of the gear, all of the sets, the talents, the builds, the exotics, everything, what do? The answer is fight other players or quit. Sure, you can run the same mission you have already run 1,000 times to get your gear with the new gear, but eventually there is literally no reward save a minuscule stat bump on an infinitely rare exact replica of your existing build that you already have. In addition to that, you memorize spawns, you memorize enemy tactics, you memorize mechanics, and eventually you are farming for no reason, fighting against things that you are fully able to predict. PvE content, unless it is made to be extremely vast and updated with new material very frequently, think Path of Exile with a new league every 3 months with a bunch of brand new mechanics every single time, PvE content has a limited lifespan. The original Division game had a larger emphasis on the Dark Zone and on PvP. The result was that even in the face of severe balancing problems, there was a very dedicated group of players who stuck with the game for an extended period of time. When the inverse is true, and to be clear, there is nothing wrong with this, I'm just stating a player-based progression here. When the inverse is true, and PvE is the main focus, without a deliberate loop that includes and emphasizes PvP, the game has a shorter and more confined activity cycle that leads to a faster drop-off when players have completed everything that they are interested in. Both methods are fine. PvP and PvE games are both wildly successful in certain contexts, but a decent chunk of the Division 2's player base, built upon the foundation of the original, were expecting an experience that incentivized and rewarded PvP gameplay, which it does to some extent, but to echo the concerns of many players I have talked to, the Dark Zone feels poorly tuned, there are no adequate incentives to populate it, and even if there were, the structure leads to a different experience than many were expecting. A difference between expectation and reality isn't always a bad thing. Again, I believe at launch, the Division 2 set a new standard for content scope and also managed to improve a great deal on the original game's flaws, but it created key differences that helped contribute to a twofold player-based decline. The first is the natural expiration of interest owing to a completion of the content presented. The second is a migration of players looking for a PvP experience they were not able to find. And combining these two things is what has presented the current situation of a perceived decline in Division 2's player base, a really large decline at that, and its overall interest levels. There are numerous other factors to consider here. One is the condition of the raid that launched, which was extremely difficult content, something I find to be appealing on principle, but tuned in such a way, and void of public matchmaking for that matter, where it excluded a large chunk of players, especially console players, from ever completing it. On top of that, there was specific gear barred behind it. Again, something I actually agree with, fundamentally, but it contributed to a casual PvE audience perhaps feeling a sense of frustration or alienation. Since the game is catered towards a casualized PvE audience, that part is honestly undeniable at this point, having dedicated hardcore driven raid material is interesting, but contradictory to a lot of other systems. The developers made a number of efforts to penalize anyone who wanted to play PvP and enjoy that competition in the Dark Zone, making it easier and easier to get gear from any and every other activity. But then, what many consider to be the pinnacle of PvE material, the raid, was tuned in such a way as to be almost entirely inaccessible to the audience they were just catering to. All combined, it constructs a game that is not quite built for any one audience, and as a result is losing every audience for different reasons. I cannot tell you the exact player base numbers, but I can say definitively that Division 2 has seen a massive decline in player interest. As it stands, the game is worthy of my purchase. I certainly don't regret it, don't think that I do, because that's not the message here, but much like the original, change is needed to rekindle the interest of its community and build back up a player base that appears to be bottoming out right now. That's it for today, though. If you want to support the channel, check out the links down below. I've recently begun plugging the Patreon page, so I will do that again now. It's just more reliable than subjecting everything to the whims of YouTube itself, because YouTube is anything but predictable. But the content will persist regardless, so don't stress about it too much. But I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.